I'd like to call to order the post-July 4th, 2018 Growth Management Policy Board meeting to order. Thanks, everyone, for not partying too hard last night, and or even if you did, making it here, ready to rock. So before we get started, I'd like to welcome a couple of new board members, and we are excited about your participation. Councilmember Steve Worthington at University Place. Steve, thanks for being with us. He's the new alternate representing Pierce County, other cities and towns, and will be here fully participating with us today. And also Sarah Wamsley is the new alternate for the Housing Development Consortium, Seattle-King County. Is she here? I'm looking around the table for a new face. Don't see her. We'll welcome her when we see her. So with that, if we could do a round of self-introductions. Again, my name is Ryan Mello. I serve on the Tacoma City Council and as your chair today.
Hi, I'm Hank Margison, City Council, City of Redmond, representing Sound Cities Association, and I serve as your vice chair.
Joanne Schuler, WashDOT.
Edna Shin from Seattle Children's, representing business and labor.
Susan Turner with Kitsap Public Health, representing public health, and forgetting to turn my mic on.
Good morning, Greg Wheeler, Mayor, City of Bremerton.
Rob Putantu, Mayor of City of Port Orchard, representing other small cities.
Let me use yours.
Okay.
Ron Peltier, Bainbridge Island City Council.
I'm sorry, Jan Schwede, Arlington City Council, representing Snohomish County.
Jennifer Galatas, Alderwood Water and Wastewater District.
Scott Bader, City of Everett.
Lynn Robinson, Bellevue Deputy Mayor.
Kathy Lambert, King County Council.
Port Alliance. Good morning. My name is Steve Worthington, University Place Council, and representing Pierce County, other cities, as an alternate.
Derek Jens, Pierce County Council.
Pete Mayer, Metro Parks Tacoma.
Sarah Wamsley, Housing Development Consortium.
Bryce Eden with Future West.
Patricia Akiyama with Master Builders of King and Snohomish County, representing business and labor.
Jay Arnold, Deputy Mayor in Kirkland, representing Sound Cities.
Good morning. Paul Winterstein, City of Issaquah City Council, representing Sound Cities.
Nancy Tosta, Burien City Council, representing Sound Cities Association.
Thank you, everyone. We have a full house, which is great. Sarah, we welcomed you right before you came into the chambers here, so we're excited to have your participation and welcome to this team. We have a couple of members on phone. Councilmember Terry Ryan from Snohomish County. Terry, are you on the phone?
I'll just say so.
Councilmember Jeannie Cole-Wells, King County. Councilmember Cole-Wells?
Is she on the phone?
And then Ian Morrison, representing NAOP. Ian, are you on the phone? Is there anyone else on the phone?
Just so you know, they may call in after our breakout discussion.
Thank you.
To participate after we come back from breakout.
Thank you. And for the record, Councilmember Gossett is here. Good morning, Councilmember.
Good morning.
Moving on to item number 3, communications. Everyone will see at your places a printout of a slide from the housing presentation. It'll make it easier to reference. And there are also handouts for the housing breakout session that we're going to have towards the latter part of our time together today. You'll also see a large print of the infographic and information about affordable housing, monthly housing costs, all to inform our dialogue this morning. So there will be a break at 11:50, and at that time there'll be lunch served, and we'll be able to come back to the room before reconvening at 12 noon. So we're just going to break for about 10 minutes, respect everybody's time, and come back and do a working lunch. So that's what we have planned today. Moving on to public comment. I'm going to call on folks who have signed in. Each member of the public wishing to give comments has 2 minutes to speak. We have an on-screen timer to help you stay on schedule. And after everyone who's signed up, you'll have an opportunity to address the board if you haven't done so. So the one and only person we have signed up is Mr. Alex Zimmerman.
Heil, my dirty double-A Führer, a Nazi social democratic mafia with progressive Gestapo principle. My name Alex Zimmerman, I am president of Stand Up America. Every time as I come to this room, I come every meeting, I call you a natural born degenerate idiot. Guys, you build a system what is totally everybody who work for government is a crook and cretina. For 30 years, I touched government from Olympia to Seattle 100 times. In all three branches, I cannot find one honest man. This reflects everything right now. For this, we have a collapse in stupidity everywhere. I give you an example. I candidate for U.S. Senator 2018. So Kitsap County auditor cut my statement by 33 words, 12%. And this support by Kitsap attorney. Nice trick. I like this. So, in rule what is we have here is idiotic too. You change this. It's okay, no problem. Right now, for another 40 seconds, I want to speak about this plan. What is you have this about housing. Guys, I'm business consultant. I see many idiots in my life, exactly in Soviet Union. But no one idiot make plan for 35 years. Ever Soviet Union communists don't did this. But you very good, comparable to German Nazi 1,000-year Reich. Yeah, you very good. Who's this idiot who have planned for 35 years? We have collapse right now. It's a revolution start in Seattle right now. A civil war start like last week when someone go and speak. So guys, stop and acting like an idiot. Bring America back to normal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to provide comment? Anyone else wishing to provide comment? Great. We'll close public comment. We'll move on to item number 4, the staff report. Paul.
All right, good morning. Thank you for turning out today, the day after the 4th. And many of you probably had late nights last night, but we should have an important discussion today about housing and a few other important business items. So I don't have anything else to report on right now. Thank you.
You can get us right to work. Item number 5 is our consent agenda. And on the consent agenda is the approval of the minutes from our June 7th meeting. Vice Chair Margison.
Move the consent agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
Properly moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The motion's adopted. Item number 6, we're going to hear about the recommendation for full certification of the comprehensive plan for Eatonville. Ms. Benjamin.
Good morning. We're going to take just a second to pull it up. Fantastic. Thank you. So the town of Eatonville recently completed their major periodic update of their comprehensive plan. A few noteworthy aspects of the plan include a robust economic development element that links environmental health and salmon populations to the town's economic development, as well as mapping and inventory of non-motorized facilities. Staff worked with town staff, and based on review of the plan, staff recommends the Growth Management and Transportation Policy Board recommend that the Executive Board certify the comprehensive plan for Eatonville. There's more information on the plan in the certification report, which is linked to the memo that's included in the packet.
Thank you for the staff report and good staff work ahead of the meeting that you provided, so thank you for that. Are there any questions, comments before we take a motion? Seeing none, is there a motion for approval? Vice Chair Margison.
All right. Then I would move the Growth Management and Transportation Policy Board. I would move the Growth Management Policy Board recommend that the Executive Board certify the comprehensive plan for Eatonville, since I can't speak on behalf of the Transportation Policy Board.
Second.
Properly moved and seconded. Any discussion on this item? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
The motion's adopted. We'll move on to Liz, who's going to talk about University Place.
Yes, thank you. So we are here to certify or recommend certification for the sub-area plan for the City of University Place. So you may recall that when we designated the City of University Place's Regional Growth Center in 2014, that there was an expectation that the city complete a sub-area plan within 2 years. I'll just flag that this is a process that will be changed under our new framework, but at the time of designation that this was the process that was in place, and so we will complete that for their particular jurisdiction. So the center is 481 acres within the City of University Place. The review in 2014 found that the center met the thresholds for existing and targeted activity, as well as the other criteria that we were reviewing for the time, and that we completed the provisional designation in 2014. Subsequent to that, the city adopted a sub-area plan, and which includes a vision to continue to transform the center into a vibrant, walkable regional destination with a mix of uses and a variety of housing and employment opportunities and other services and attributes. So this vision and plan are really consistent with the planning that we expect from regional growth centers, and would recommend a certification of this plan to complete their designation as a regional growth center. So the action is presented on the screen.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you for the background material. Mr. Yaden.
So I was reading the plan this morning. I think it's great, and I'm pretty excited to see the University Place taking these steps. The one thing I do want to say is when I'm reading through the plan, and something that hopefully will come up later in conversations, is it talks about Generation Y not wanting to own a home and prefer to rent as an assumption. And I think that that's kind of out of tune to what a lot of us in my generation who sit in there and think more about, we have student loans that no one else has had before that are holding us back from owning a home, and the size and location of houses aren't exactly where we want them to be. So I understand it's just an assumption and generalization, but as we move into our next conversation, if we're putting these in planning documents, we're going to have a lot of issues as we continue to grow older and try and buy homes, because I can tell you a lot of us want them right now.
Thank you for that reflection. Councilmember Worthington, did you want to speak to this body of work and or make a motion when you're ready?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. As a matter of fact, I do. And so I would like to move that the Growth Management Policy Board take action on this and approve the University Place Comprehensive Plan.
Is there a second?
Second.
Properly moved and seconded. Any discussion on this item? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The motion's adopted. Thank you. Good work. Congratulations, Councilmember Worthington. Item number 8, one of the major reasons why we're all here. We're going to spend the bulk of our time today on housing. We do finish with a update on the Regional Open Space Conservation Plan, which we've been following and working on for some time. So that is our final item. But before we get to that, we're hoping to dive deeper into this topic today's in a similar deep dive as we had last time in growth in general. So I'm going to call on Paul, who's going to help frame up our discussion this morning. Paul?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning again. So Laura and I are going to go through a few different slides to get us warmed up. We hope that the bulk of today's discussion is really for you to talk with each other about how do we address housing in Vision 2050, and then come back with potentially some preliminary direction for us as to how we might move forward in creating some materials for you to review over the course of the end of the year and into next year. This won't be an adoption type meeting, but if we can get a sense of some broad direction, that would be great. I think what we heard back in, it was either the January or February meeting when we were talking about the scope of Vision 2040, and many people identified housing. One or two talked about putting a laser focus on housing, and it really identified the need for this to be a priority issue. So I think, to the extent that we can follow up on that, one of the challenges here is talking about it as a regional issue, as opposed to just a local issue in our individual neighborhoods or what's happening. But in the past, we've seen some areas be unaffordable, but other parts of the regions, kind of balance that out and have more affordability. At the Kitsap County retreat a few weeks ago, I think perhaps the most important issue that they identified was housing affordability. So one of the areas that we used to see as more affordable, they said housing affordability is really a big issue for them. And maybe before we get started, if we don't want to spend all day kind of just worrying about the problem. We want to talk more about solutions. But maybe if a couple of you want to talk about what do you see as the housing problem? Anybody want to?
Mayor
So
Wheeler?
I'd be happy to lead off. Thank you, Chair Mello. So the what's happening in City of Bremerton, and I can give you that perspective is case study. I rode the ferry over today with a real nice person who finally decided that they wanted to be a homeowner, and so chose and have an hour commute on the ferry rather than unpredictable commute over our roads leading into the job center. And so what's happening is we're getting more and more of this every day. And these are obviously they're fantastic folks moving in, and they're doing it for economic reasons. And so will end up happening and is happening is, since we were that last place, Bremerton was that affordable place on the Kitsap Peninsula, folks are running out of options in our entire region. So you choose Mason County. You start to move your commute away from Bremerton, the folks that are there, into an area that's rural, isn't part of the PSRC growth management, the way we plan here. Their land use is different, culture different, and so, and this is a big concern because folks are either being displaced or in danger of being displaced. And personally, the way, and I started addressing this at City Hall, in trying to explain the Growth Management Act and the goals of it, which are to preserve rural spaces, preserve open spaces, keep our neighborhoods intact, keep our parks intact within our cities. And so leads into a supply and demand type of discussion where folks might say, well, we just have to increase supply to get ahead of this. And I say, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think we can outbuild this issue where we have 1.8 million people coming into the region over the next 30 years. And we are already so built out in a lot of our centers that we've identified over the years. And so my philosophy now is to continue to try to exceed demand with supply, but also to try to provide incentives and really increase this effort where we have incentives for developer set aside. And I think we really have to get aggressive with that. And my biggest concern with that is if we do that as a jurisdiction in Bremerton, somebody will go where the most profit can be made or the easiest pickings are for development. So I personally believe a regional approach to this is very, very important because we can reward jurisdictions that are competing for infrastructure dollars, I believe, who take this this forward-looking approach. And if we didn't come at it as a region, I'm afraid we'd just be each competing with each other, and we'd end up where we are.
Great. So. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Patanzu?
Yeah, as the mayor just across the Santa Clara Inlet from Mayor Wheeler, we're taking a little different approach over in Port Orchard, and we've been looking for opportunity to revitalize our downtown for years, and I think the high-speed ferry and this connection to Bremerton to Port Orchard, we've got a 10-minute crossing from Port Orchard to Bremerton, and we're planning for this and embracing this and wanting this in our downtown, in our community. And we're trying to create that a walkable community that you can, mixed-use development that you can walk out your doorstep. You don't necessarily have to have a car. You can walk to that foot ferry, to the high-speed ferry or the slower car boat, and get to your job here in downtown Seattle. So we're really excited about this opportunity in Port Orchard.
Thank you. Commissioner Steinbrook.
Sure. So, noting that the question began with what is the problem,
rather than what's the solution. So I guess we'll get to that later.
Exactly.
I wish someone had a good solution. But, well, I see three things. First of all, on a macro level, the problem is that housing production generally outstrips, reverse that.
Yep.
Economic growth and jobs outstrip housing production. That's just almost a constant. You can't build fast enough in a growth economy when employment is expanding. And I think we're seeing that right now. Then secondly, I think that the housing preferences available in the job centers don't always match, the choices available don't match preferences. And I think those preferences go well beyond affordability. I think there are locational issues, there's quality of life issues, walkability, there's schools, there's perceptions of crime and safety, et cetera, and people are willing to forego long distances to make their choices for what meets their desires. And thirdly, builders do not build below median as a general rule. Why would they? If they're in a growth market with high demand, why would they build at a lower margin of profit and without some inducement? And I think that's where the claim that if you simply increase supply, you're going to bring the cost down. No builder wants to be stuck in an oversupply. That's just common sense. So let's not fool ourselves about that.
So maybe just one or two more?
Thank you, Commissioner. Councilmember Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's already been kind of stated a couple times, but just to put a finer point on it, we have a pretty significant regional housing and jobs balance issue. I've brought this up in our previous discussions, but when you, through the market can drive a lot of growth into one area, but also our policy choices do have an impact there. And so we have chosen, to some extent, to encourage, through transportation investments in particular, jobs to concentrate in a couple cities in King County, and to put the housing largely in other areas. That's a policy choice. And I think we need to recognize what those policy choices are and the difference between the ones where the market's driving it, because there's really nothing you can do about that. You can nudge the market, but ultimately it's our policy choices that we need to focus on. And so far, while we have stated as our this is our value, is that we're going to have this multi-center approach around the region, that's not in fact how this is working. And so I think we need to recognize that. I've had the chance to visit a lot of folks at their doors recently for reasons I won't go into, but in one day, I talked to 3 different people who that week had moved to North Cape Harbor, my community, from Seattle. 3 in one day. That's pretty extraordinary. And those are folks that are clearly being driven for economic reasons to, the furthest reach of our region, make the longest commute possible back to Seattle. And so I think we have to figure out a way to serve those folks closer to where they intend to work, or to try to figure out, and I think this is the real key, try to figure out a way to get more work to the places where people want to live.
Thank you, Councilmember. We're going to take these last 3 personal anecdotal reflections. So, Councilmember Peltier.
Yes, I'd just like to ask that while we discuss the creative approaches to how we can address housing needs, that we keep in mind our other goals, and to restore and protect the environment, and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because they're very directly related to the type of development that we're talking about, development that very often results in the loss of forest lands, degradation of watersheds, additional polluted stormwater runoff, additional effluent from septic and sewage. And we know our sewage treatment plants need to be upgraded where they're not removing enough nitrogen and chemicals of concern. So I just hope that while we're talking about this, and I think this is a great discussion, that we can kind of appreciate the need to be really creative in how we do this, because it's just not just a matter of building more housing. We have other things that we want to preserve and protect so that we all want to continue living in the Puget Sound region.
Thank you. Councilmember Robinson.
So in Bellevue, I would say the biggest problem is that we're losing our spectrum of affordability. And so, like, if 75% of the men in our year-round homeless shelter could afford 30% AMI in our city, but we just don't have that kind of stock. And the older housing that we do have that is somewhat affordable is being mowed down and replaced with newer housing that's much more expensive. So I think for our city, we need to focus on retaining our affordable housing. That's good for the environment as well. It's the most affordable way to create or maintain affordable housing. And then get more mid-range condos in there. We need to work with that state law because we have so many 2 adults living in 5-bedroom homes in Bellevue, and there's no really good alternative for them. And once we move them out, then our single-family homes are open to families, and that'll help a lot. So that's what we need to focus on.
Thank you. Councilmember Gossett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I currently serve on the King County Affordable Housing Task Force, and we are 12 elected officials who are looking at this issue. And our challenges have come down primarily in 3 areas: supply, and then quality of housing, and part of that is space, and then thirdly is cost or affordability. We believe that by the year 2040, we need 244,000 more units to keep up with the need for housing in King County. And at first we were talking about, that's 11,000 to 12,000 a year, but then a couple of public nonprofit developers of low-income housing said that's ridiculous to plan like that. In King County, we need 122,000 units of housing for poor people right now. And as Peter was talking about a little earlier, very few developers can help us in that regard unless we have significant incentives, public money. And then a couple of members of our task force have said we got to have billions of dollars for our county. In Seattle, Washington alone, the population growth is 250 people per day. And that's an extreme challenge. And finally, it is my hope that in those 3 areas, we'll be able to develop some 20-year goals and then some measures of continuing to evaluate the primary challenges of achieving some of our goals and affordability. Of the 240,000 houses needed, about 100, somewhere between 70 and 90,000 units need to be affordable to people at 50% of the income. The average income in King County right now is $80,000. So it's a huge challenge and has a lot to do with why we have so many tents in one of the most beautiful counties in the world. So those are our problems. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that reflection, Councilmember. Paul, back to you.
Right. So I think that those were great comments, and I think what they do is help identify the complexity. Within housing, we're talking about from income levels from 0 to 30% AMI, as Councilmember Robinson was talking about, as well as more moderate income and higher income levels. But even when the housing's not being built at that level, we're talking about the relationship to location and transportation and jobs, impacts to the environment. So this is, I think, a very complex topic. We're going to try to do justice within the next couple of hours to making some progress of working, as Commissioner Steinberg was saying, working more towards the success part rather than just dwelling in the problem part. With that, we're going to try to orient this towards the regional aspect. What can we do more at a regional level between cities and talking to each other and coordinating with each other, and perhaps focusing a little bit on the more precise housing aspect of the problem as opposed to some of the environmental and jobs aspects that talk about it, recognizing that this really does intertwine with the entire aspects of Vision 2050 that we'll be working on over the course of the year. And we also want to get into what does it mean for the plan itself. So housing's a big issue, lots of stuff to it. In some ways, our goal is to not simply satisfy, this big challenge of housing, but it's to update Vision 2040. And we have an existing chapter. So just looking at that a little bit, we have policies today that talk about production, the location, fair and equal access, the need for affordability, healthy and safe home choices. So we have some really good policies. And in one of those King County Affordable Housing Task Force meetings that Councilmember Gossett was referring to, the mayor of Bellevue talked about, he was looking at the countywide policies, which are somewhat similar, and he was kind of like, well, we have these good policies, so what is it that we're not doing? And in some ways, that's part of the question here today, too. We have an existing housing chapter in Vision 2040. We have some good policies. We also have a couple of actions about having a regional housing strategy. And we developed some different toolkits and information to provide to local jurisdictions. And when we went through the comprehensive plan review process, we saw most of the cities, I think I'd say every city, every county, I don't know that anybody's missing from this group, really do a strong update on their housing elements, put in some really strong policies, talking about affordability and the need for affordability in their community. So from a general planning standpoint, it seems like we've done a lot of work already. I was in San Francisco last week and talked a bit with John Ram, the planning director down there, who used to work for Seattle. And you kind of think about, we have a problem. San Francisco really has a tremendous problem that we're at least doing better than they are, and we'll talk about that in a minute in comparing some of the data. It's not a lot of solace to know that we're doing better than them. We still have a big enough challenge here. And in some ways, our challenge here is related. We have a lot of different things. We put together a little infographic, and we'll talk about this maybe just slightly during our presentation, but there are many things affecting housing. Housing prices in California affect the housing prices here. Federal interest rates affect housing prices and the ability to borrow. We can't control those things, but as Councilmember Young was saying, but there are things where we can affect policy and create some nudges and push things in certain directions, and so that's where we want to talk about. I'm going to turn it over to Laura to run through just a handful of the data. Well, I'll do this first. In a minute, we understand lots of data. This is really just to kind of give kind of a snapshot and recognizing that you really already understand this problem well, but it just helps kind of emphasize the magnitude of the problem. As far as the housing chapter goes, like I said, some good policies in there today. The narrative and the data about housing can certainly be updated. It's 10-year-old data. We can put in new information. We can put in information about the housing need. So Councilmember Gossett had some of those numbers about what is our need for housing at different income levels. We can put in some additional information that talks about housing need in our region. Our general advice would be to retain the policies that we have, and based upon your discussions, maybe look at some specific targeted changes where we need to make some improvements. And then looking at those housing actions, maybe we want to take these forward, define something more specific of what would PSRC be doing over the next, say, 5 years to continue to make progress on this issue. So that's what we think might be chapter updates, and we'll come back at the end of the meeting to see kind of how your discussion's gone and to get some confirmation about should we start preparing some information for these types of chapter updates and then bring them back to you at a future time. So with that, I'm going to hand it to Laura to run through some data.
Great, thank you. So we're just going to look at a few key data points. As Paul mentioned, there's the infographic at your seat, which has more information, and also I believe Paul sent out an email 2 or 3 weeks ago that had links. We did a background paper a few weeks ago. It's long, there's a lot of data, so right now we're just going to focus on a few key things that we think can inform our discussions we're going to be moving forward. So hopefully this comes as no surprise to anyone. Home prices are on the rise. We can see there is some variation among the 4 counties, but that the trend overall is that they're all increasing. And not only have they increased, but they're increasing more quickly in the past few years. So we've seen increases in home prices since 2011, but in the past 3 years, we've seen that the percentage growth is even more so. So you can see on the 2 maps on the left, lighter blue, meaning growth was a little bit slower, and as it's getting darker blue on the map on the left, or on the right, home prices are picking up. We also see that rents are increasing. Again, similar with home value, there's some variation among the 4 counties, but again, overall, all trending upward. And one thing that's interesting to see is where are there areas that are already really expensive and where are there areas that are becoming more expensive. So the map on the left, the dark blue areas, that's median rent. So the darker blue means it's going to be a more expensive place to live. And the map on the right is showing the percent growth in rent. So those are dark. So the darker blue areas on the map on the right are showing places that perhaps were more affordable and are becoming more expensive and less affordable. So it's interesting to see that change. One thing that was noted in the beginning of our discussion is we have a lot of job growth, and the construction industry and housing growth has trouble keeping up with that. So this shows job and housing growth each year. We realize this isn't a one-to-one comparison. Often more than one worker lives in a house, but it is interesting to see, we had big dips in jobs in 2008, 2009 with the recession, but since then we've seen job growth really just continue to grow. Another way to look at that, and this is a bit more of a one-to-one comparison, is looking at housing unit and household growth. So usually we have one household and one housing unit. So it's interesting to see actually that from 2007 to about 2011, we actually were building more housing units than new households were moving to the region. And then we saw that shift after the recession as job growth really started to rise. And one thing to note is we are seeing this trend change a little bit. In 2016 to 2017 was the first year post-recession where we actually had more housing units built than new households came to the region. And with all the new housing units that are being built, we're seeing some trends and changes there as well. About 2/3 of new units are multifamily units. This is primarily driven by construction in King County, but we are seeing that in all counties there's a rise in the number of multifamily units being built. We also see there are a lot less homes that are available for sale. So you can see there's actually a little bit less variation among the counties in this, and they're all trending downward. And especially in King County, that's a pretty drastic drop, that in just 7 years it went from about 145,000 to basically they lost 100,000 in their inventory. Also, as Paul mentioned, when we look at other major West Coast markets, Seattle's relatively cheaper. So looking at that x-axis on the bottom there, that's median home price. So we see that San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco all have higher median home value. So while yes, it's very expensive here, and we don't want to say that there isn't a problem here, for someone perhaps who is living in San Francisco, Seattle is a more attractive place.
Is that Seattle regionally or Seattle the city?
This is the Seattle metro area. So this is using Zillow data. So this is going to be King, Snohomish, and Pierce counties.
Mayor Wheeler?
Is that San Francisco metro area?
I believe it's San Francisco City County. So we have a lot of data on housing, but I know it's a deeply personal issue, and oftentimes we kind of lose fact of the people this affects, who we're talking about, of who can afford homes, who's losing homes, things like that. So just wanted to provide a few examples. So for a 4-person household earning 80% AMI, so this is below area median income. Sometimes it's called low income, sometimes it's called moderate or workforce housing. Some of the definitions are a little fuzzy. But that could be 2 full-time workers earning $17 an hour, which is just slightly above the Seattle minimum wage, or 1 full-time worker earning $33 an hour. Examples of that would be an accountant, an office clerk, and a security guard, perhaps, who are both working. So jobs that we often think of as earning a respectable salary are actually making less than our median income. Another example for a two-person household earning 50% AMI, so this would be considered lower income. And in this example, we're looking at one worker, so perhaps a single parent, a couple where a partner's unable to work, a full-time worker earning $16 an hour, and examples of that would be a first-time teacher, their first year in the workforce teaching, they'd make shy of $38,000, or a restaurant cook as well. And then when we talk about a household earning 30% AMI, so very low income, these are some of our most vulnerable and housing unstable residents. If we had a three-person household with one worker, that could be a cashier working full-time, earning about minimum wage. Also a home health aide would be another example of that. So just trying to put a little context when we talk about these numbers, kind of who these people could be, who these people are in our communities. And what we see with wage growth or wage stagnation and rising home prices is that more people are spending more of their income on housing. So when we talk about cost burden, spending more than 30% of your income on housing costs, so that could be mortgage plus utilities or rent plus utilities plus a parking space, that kind of all gets rolled up into housing costs. If you spend more than 30%, you're considered cost burdened, and if you spend more than 50%, you're considered severely cost burdened. And in this chart, one of the key things to look at is those top two rows. So those are very low income households earning less than $20,000 or $20,000 to $35,000 a year. And you can see there, especially in that top row for less than $20,000, almost 3/4 of those households spend over 50% of their income on housing. So if you were making about $20,000 a year, 10,000 of that went to housing, you would have 10,000 less for going for groceries, medical care, transportation costs, clothes, any other incidentals that come up. So these are folks who are often housing unstable, where a rent increase might push them to living in a car or on the streets and things like that. So these are very vulnerable populations. We also see for folks who are trying to buy a home for the first time, it's becoming more challenging. So this is the Housing Affordability Index for first-time buyers. So an index of 100 means that a median-priced home is affordable to a household making median income. That's kind of the balance point there. So we can see that Kitsap County is still about at that 100, but as the numbers get lower, that becomes less affordable. So we can see that, especially in King, Pearson, Snohomish, all trending downward, making it harder for first-time homeowners to get into the market. People are renting longer. And also, as was described earlier, people are also driving farther to be able to afford a home they can own. So this is data from Zillow and a company they work with called Here Technologies. And they actually looked into what the monthly savings were depending on how long you increased your commute. So you can see there's kind of a sweet spot there that if you increase your commute 35 to 60 minutes, you can save a close to $1,600 a month versus living in the central Seattle area. And then as you get farther away, perhaps because of increased travel costs, different types of housings, things like that, you actually aren't saving quite as much. I'll pass it back to Paul.
Right. So now we'll switch to just talking about some of the things that are happening before we break out. I won't go through all these things. I think it's safe to say that there's a lot of different things that either have been done or are being done. Mark could certainly talk to some of the state work with the HART report. King County and its cities are working on, have a task force that's working really hard at identifying some solutions. There are things that we've done in the past through growing transit communities and a housing innovations program. And like I said, most comprehensive plans have addressed this, at least in their policies, if not taking actions with a number of their sub-area plans on having incentive programs and other tools. So we want to talk about how do we kind of move this forward? How do we move this ball down the road or down the field? I should keep my analogy straight. And the discussion today, we picked out some different categories. Down in the lower right, the regional goals and expectations. So we'll talk a little bit about, what's success? Can we build all those units? What's realistic? What do we want to aim for? And then we can also talk about what are some of the types and categories of tools that we need. Do we need more money? Do we need more coordination amongst jurisdictions so that we're kind of all trying to do the same thing, like Mayor Wheeler was saying, so we're not competing against each other? Do we need more assistance? We heard from some of the smaller cities that they would like to do more, but that requires writing code, having a city attorney to review it, being able to defend actions if they get appealed. Do we need more support from the state? Do we need to be able to lobby the state for specific actions or talk to others? This was a really useful graphic we found, at least. This comes from the King County Task Force that they put together, so credit goes to them. But it gets to that idea that there are multiple layers to the market and that they overlap and impact each other. So we tend to, I think, just kind of talk about all of it all together at one time in many sense. So, somebody will be talking about somebody that can't afford to live at a low income, and then the next person might start talking about being able to buy a house with 3 bedrooms. And those are really connected, even though they might be distinct segments of the market. And so what this is showing is that on the right-hand side, we have market rent and home ownership. And so a large portion, so we have this is, again, just looking at King County, but really the same thing applies more or less in any market. So we have a chunk of the market, the far right-hand side, the green box, that is earning more than 125% of AMI and has the opportunity for home ownership. We have a market rent area that goes to lower income, so we have kind of a broader area that might be satisfied by what the market produces at a rent level. We have that orange area that's in the middle where they're kind of close to that. Some of them might fit within what's available by the market, especially in the rental area. Some of them might, in more expensive locations, might need some subsidy or some sort of incentive program to help them. And that's where we see a lot of cities doing innovative things with incentives and bonuses, where they get a developer to, say, build an apartment building and 10% of the units have some sort of affordability attached to them. The multifamily tax exemption is something that targets typically the 80% AMI and below, so that's a great tool where that can provide an incentive to developers to providing some units at affordable levels within a building. So that workforce housing, 50 to 80%, often can kind of be satisfied by the market, but oftentimes needs an incentive or a bonus to really get the market to respond to it. As was pointed out over here, just given the development pressure and intensity, the market will aim towards the more expensive house because of the economics of just there's more profit. And so if there's strong demand on the expensive side, more of the development pressure will go there to be able to satisfy that need. That's not to say that developers are evil or anything like that. They're just following where there's that opportunity. And then on the far left side of this chart, it's showing that those are people that can afford a rent that is very difficult, and that we don't see the ability for the market to be able to provide that the gap between what they can pay in rent and what the market can, what the market will charge is too great, and there needs to be subsidy there. So some people talk about market solutions, some people talk about funding solutions, and really this graphic is just a way of showing that it's that spectrum. The more that we can do on the subsidy side, the more pressure it takes off on the left side. The more we can do on the market side, the more pressure it takes off on the right-hand side. And I think ideally, we kind of have some strategies that work at all elements of the spectrum. So we just want to do a quick recap of what we've heard from some others. We had a great session on May 17th. We had an all-afternoon session with about 80 different housing stakeholders, a lot of housing providers, and people in the development community, and people that work for cities, and lots of great feedback and suggestions. And in fact, we developed a table of strategies that's several pages long. Do you remember how many strategies we have?
16 pages long.
16 pages of strategy, so however many that adds up to, that we generated and evaluated through that session. So there are lots of good ideas and strategies. Some of the keynotes of that is really recognizing the regional issue of this, about how if housing becomes too expensive in one community, it quickly overlaps to the next. And somebody might be working in one, living in another. So there's a lot of interdependence between geographies. As I mentioned before, the need for technical assistance. A lot of smaller cities have a hard time implementing these more complex incentive programs or funding programs or other tools. And the opportunity with growth, kind of the optimistic side here is that as we grow, we do have that opportunity to look for affordability within high growth areas and especially near transit. We also talked to the TUD Advisory Committee. That's one of our standing committees. And they talked a lot about how do we identify that numeric affordability goal. So down in the orange box, these are the percent of households at those different income levels. So 13% of our households earn less than 30% of the median income. 12% of households earn 30 to 50%. 18% earn 50 to 80%. So those are kind of the most challenging households to serve. And they had a great discussion about really needing to identify these goals of serving these communities, while at the same time recognizing there's a huge amount of variability between each city. Different types of cities, proximity to centers, proximity to jobs, different types of zoning in place, that it can't be a one-size-fits-all solution, but really wanting to have actions that can address that need. They also recognize placemaking, that it's not just about having tons of housing built, but also creating communities that are really livable and are attractive places for people. What's that? Oh, yes. Where is Jay? Jay's right. So he's Jay is co-chair. Councilmember Arnold is co-chair of that TUD committee. So perhaps you would like to, rather than me explaining what the committee talked about.
I'd like to emphasize a couple of points. I think you did a good job of summarizing our discussion. I co-chair the Regional TOD Committee with Marty Koistra of the Housing Development Consortium. And we talked a lot about the numeric goals and tying them down at that next level to workforce affordability, looking at workforce housing and lower income units. But we also acknowledged the barriers of dealing with local goals and thought that PSRC may be a good group to provide support and help break down barriers on how we link these needs that we're talking about today to specific areas around transit. Because there was strong support within our transit communities of saying we're a big part of the housing solution, leveraging our transit investment. The local jurisdiction can provide incentives and funding mechanisms and requirements to do this. I think it's PSRC that can provide some of the support in how we do that on each particular area. And then finally, as Paul mentioned, a lot of discussion on placemaking and how we put in the policies to make sure that amenities and services are provided in addition to those new housing units around transportation.
Thanks, Jay. So before I get to those problem statements, I just want to recognize some of the help. We had these different committees. When we had the peer networking toolkit discussion, we had a great presentation from Alex Casey from Zillow. You saw a handful of those Zillow slides included in what Laura just presented. They have a more extensive presentation that we have a link to that I sent out in one of the emails, and it's available on our website. We also had great presentations from Beacon about what it takes to build affordable housing, and from Marty at HDC. And so really have had some great data from those groups, as well as from King County and from many of your comprehensive plans. So I want to thank all those people. For today, we tried to make this effort as to taking this complex issue and put it into 3 categories for your discussion. And it seemed like the kind of the three big pots, if you will, for talking about it is how do we address long-term housing supply? How do we avoid getting into the situation like we might see in some of the California communities where they're not building housing or not building very much, to how do we ensure that housing's continuing to get built, that the market can thrive and can provide a range of housing in our communities. I think what I learned working in the local jurisdiction is that this takes a lot of time. It takes several years to do the planning work and then get the zoning in place, and then you have to hit the market cycle, and then the development has to start happening. Just a lot of pieces have to come together, and it takes a lot of time. And so we have sort of the advantage of, we're talking about the year 2050. So we're not looking so much here, I think, for a solution that's going to solve affordability today, but how do we continue to provide that supply of housing so that over the next 30 years, we're continuing to see housing be built through the region. Second problem statement is about affordability. Do we have an opportunity, or what opportunities do we have to provide more housing at those affordable levels? Whether it's at the very low or at the moderate incomes, workforce housing, what have you, how can we get more of that built? Is that something we can do in every community? Is it something we can do in every development? And I think Mayor Wheeler's statement about, how can we make this part of our downtown? How can we make it part of our cities is really kind of the key question here. And then we heard somebody, I forget who now, mentioned maintaining the communities that have some existing affordability. So where there is some existing affordability, how do we maintain some of that? I don't think any of us want to have the policy that says, well, we're going to maintain affordability by neglecting a community, not offering transportation or jobs. Certainly that's one way. But I think we want to suggest that as we provide more transportation opportunity, as we provide jobs and amenities to those communities, we still have the opportunity to maintain affordability and avoid displacement, but not, say, necessarily freezing a transit community in place while allowing it to develop, allowing more housing around that transit opportunity, but also at the same time maintaining an opportunity of affordability in those locations. So those are kind of the three buckets that we thought would be great for today's discussion. We heard at some of the last meetings questions about accountability. How do we kind of ensure that we're making progress? How do we measure and monitor this? And we think those are important discussions, but maybe we start with these three and then come back at a future meeting to talk about how do we measure, how do we track some of those aspects. So questions for the board, and this is for your breakout discussions, but so what does success look like? What is needed to address these three problems, these three buckets of problems? And then what are the roles? What can we do as PSRC or as a region? What can we do collectively? What can cities, counties, towns, and other stakeholders do to work to implement and monitor these different efforts and strategies within the three different categories? So instructions for what we do next. Do you want to do?
Paul, before you break us up, I think there's a couple of clarifying questions or comments.
Yeah, thank you.
And then we can do a breakout. Councilmember Robinson?
I'll just say, I know you said we're going to save accountability for another time, but I do think it's an integral part of this discussion. You can do all those things, but if there's not a political will to implement, it's not going to happen. And we're seeing a little bit of that in Bellevue, I'm sorry. So I think that as funding becomes available, the key to unlocking that has got to be some sort of a plan and action as well.
Mr. Mayor?
Thank you, Chair. Paul, maybe for a clarifying question relative to homelessness. For purposes of this dialogue, are we seeing the issue of temporary or transitional housing or mitigation, stabilization sites, whatever words we want to use, but are we carving that out? That's something independent and separate from this dialogue, and we're really talking about a single family, multifamily, roof over head. We're not talking the realm of other issues that all these communities are addressing kind of ad hoc to some degree in terms of addressing the immediate homelessness situation. And so I guess that's a clarifying question around.
I think my advice would be to talk about the housing component of that. I mean, as everybody knows, there's a social aspect, there's a drug-related aspect, there's tent encampments aspect. So there's a lot of things that are maybe more in the social services aspect. I think here I would suggest in this problem area about if we could have affordable housing, then that certainly is connecting to can we create housing opportunities. However, and that could be widely defined from tiny houses or cottage encampments, but where it's a housing opportunity that then alleviates a homelessness issue, as opposed to, say, shelter and services issues, which maybe we save for a separate discussion.
Councilmember Lambert.
I just wanted to highlight a couple of factors that we're hearing on a number of task forces. Number one, the cities are saying, as this happens, I don't want to lose the character of my city. So whatever that means, I think we should ask the cities, what is your character? And I know one city I asked said, we have a downtown that's historical, and we don't want that to change. So if we're going to do taller buildings, please don't make us do it and include the property that we consider our heritage, our culture, our character. Lynn said earlier about townhouses. We've got to go to Olympia together and get townhouse regulations changed so people can move in. One of the things we need to relook at is the fact that in the planning last year, we told people in North Bend, you can't grow in North Bend because there's housing slots available in Renton. And that was very difficult for many people because their football teams, their babysitters, their mother, their grandmother, their church is wherever they were before. And moving when you're 70 or 80 is not an easy thing to do. And trying to make people able to age in place. The other factor is senior housing. Some people are getting older, and we need to be aware of that. And one of the things I learned from Seattle Housing is that they are now saying housing for seniors should be 2 bedrooms, not 1, because the second bedroom should be for their caretaker so that they can age in place, which I thought was an interesting factor. I'm seeing a lot of the new housing in my district being 3 and 4 floors in one house. I don't know about you, but I don't want 80 stairs inside my house, or 50 or 60. It's great if you want to exercise for a week, but I don't think that's a good idea. And I think that one other factor people are talking about, especially up in Skykomish, is the VBRO problem, vacation rental by owners, that people are buying houses in these places to rent them only and not have them for housing. So I think that's an impact that we haven't thought about before. And the last comment is that the Case-Shiller Index, which is a national index, shows our area as zero supply in several categories. And I think that should be one of our factors, that we don't let that happen. Thank you.
So a couple of more questions, and then we're going to get into small groups to go really deep into these conversations. So Commissioner Steinbrook.
Thanks. Thank you. Just a quick comment or two here. And what I don't hear any discussion or attention given to is the other half of the equation, which is household income. We almost never talk about strategies to raise incomes. Why not? It seems to me if you consider that housing production, the costs are not directly associated with household income, the market is, but raising household incomes is a way to respond, should be a strategy, it seems to me, when we have that many people who are low income earners. And then 2, and I would mention port jobs, just to put a plug in, on average are at living income wages throughout our region. So one of the reasons I'm there. Number 2 is I never hear much discussion about the role and responsibilities of our public housing authorities. What are they doing? What are they there for, if not to address the inequality of housing affordability and access?
Thank you, Commissioner. We can tell your peers you did a plug for the port. You did your job. Mayor Patansu.
You know, in the work that came out to us ahead of the meeting, there were a list of 11 tools or incentives for affordable housing. And I guess I'd like, if it's possible, like to see some data. Who is implementing these tools? Are we just giving this lip service? So there's some tools available to us, and I know my community is utilizing a couple of these and is looking at others. So I'd like to see who is using these tools and how we can implement the tools that we have before us.
Great question. I have one last question before you break us up, and I'm going to go to Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Councilmember Mello. I know that all of you in your day-to-day work hear a lot of concerns about preservations of community character, and it seems like it comes up as a barrier to meeting the solution or meeting the needs that we all have. But I want to kind of, as we go into small groups, just leave you with maybe a pivot from that, which is that we know that the housing policies that as a nation we have had in place for decades have really contributed to a lot of the persistent segregation and racial inequities that we see still today. So as we look at, how do we really turn the table upside down on how to meet all of our needs, we have this incredible opportunity to really undo a lot of the harms that our policies have created and perpetuated. So I hope that when you hear concerns about community character, you can kind of pivot in your own mind to maybe that isn't always a bad thing, shifting it a little different. That's all.
Thank you for that comment, Sarah. My question is around, stay focused on housing, but everything's interrelated. If folks have more money in their pocket because they're making more income or they're spending less on transportation, then they have more money for incidentals or housing. So we do a really good job of bringing in data about housing, as you've done in this presentation and many others. Are we continuing to track the cost of transportation in a similar way so that we know what percentage of folks' income they're spending on transportation, and if they're able to reduce that, obviously they can then spend it on something else?
We are tracking that, and in the background paper that I believe Paul included a link to, and I believe actually on the infographic there's a QR code. I didn't know how it worked. I learned if you turn on your camera, if you have a smartphone, and hover it over the QR code, the background paper will magically open in your browser on your phone. It's pretty cool. There's a section on housing and transportation. The wonky term for that is often H+T. And we have some cool maps showing housing costs and then housing costs when you factor in transportation. And it's interesting to see in some of those more suburban, ex-urban areas where housing costs are lower, when you factor in the transportation, they become less affordable.
Thank you for pointing me to that.
We do now.
Yes, so we are going to break up into small groups. We have the 3 problem statements. Everyone's going to get a chance to talk about all 3 problem statements. So you should have a worksheet at your seat. It's 3 pages, 1 for each problem statement, and on the front page of that there should be a colored sticky note. So the yellow sticky note group is going to be congregating over by the flags. The red sticky note group is going to be congregating over here kind of by public comment. And the blue sticky note group is going to go next door into the conference room. And we're going to ask you to just move once. We're going to have the facilitators, the staff members are going to be the ones that rotate. So we'll break out. We'll be doing this for about 45 minutes. Once we wrap up the small group discussions, lunch will be out on the table, so you can grab that as you come back to your seats for us to reconvene.
All right, we're going to start back up as you finish or continue eating lunch. And want to recognize that we'll both have minutes of the meeting, of course, but we'll also work to write up the notes from this exercise and provide that back to you for future discussions about housing as we continue through this update process. So if you're really interested in kind of maintaining the notes, we'll take these flip charts and the notes here and keep record of them so that we can come back to them at the future meetings. We have one more item today, so we want to do a relatively quick recap and kind of final discussion with the board, making sure that we leave enough time for the open space discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Ben to start with the recap, talking about the what's the title of your group again, Ben?
We were the Maintaining Affordability over the Long Term, and so a lot of great discussions in all of the groups. So just a couple of high-level pieces. One would be the PSRC's role of being an information clearinghouse of different types of incentives that would assist in affordability. Maintaining affordability is a role that PSRC can play, that the plan should highlight, that local jurisdictions should be planning for, ideally no net loss of existing affordable units, if not, and of course to try to increase those. Some interesting conversations about the need for greater awareness of sort of the longer term nature of the problem and the potential for displacement, and so tools and information that PSRC can provide about displacement would be helpful. And then also a recognition that there is going to have to be some level of public investment to meet the needs of those households that the market is not going to supply, particularly the very, very low income. There's real roles for housing authorities and other public entities to help supply that housing. So for all in all, PSRC to be an information clearinghouse, provide model ordinances, technical support for the many jurisdictions in the region, many of whom do have limited capacity to elevate this in their plans and in their local approaches to housing.
Great. So I worked with Liz on the Promote Affordable Housing in All Development. This was the group focusing more on what we can do for residents where the market's not going to provide those units affordable to them. We heard a lot of support for strongly promoting or even requiring affordable housing in all new development. There was especially interest in high-capacity transit areas or along corridors where we have big transportation investments. Also heard that all communities have a role in providing affordable housing. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but that we can all be players in this. There was a lot of support for technical assistance, that developing incentives and subsidies and things of that nature are pretty complex, and that having support for that is really important. And finally, there was support for helping with public opposition, NIMBYism, however you'd like to call it or categorize it, but just how can we garner support both locally and region-wide for this type of development.
Great, thanks, Laura. And on Becca Maskin and I worked on the supply question, addressing long-term housing supply. And there, some of the things that we've heard was just that the need to identify and plan for that future housing supply over the long term, and specifically across the range of incomes and housing types, and a lot of people identifying townhomes and kind of middle density home structures as being something that many communities lack. So looking not just at having kind of an overall number, but making sure that we have housing being provided and zoning for it that addresses that range and spectrum of housing needs in the future. There's interest in state assistance in planning, perhaps that there's some tie of, communities that are doing more planning for housing and affordable housing, that there's some planning grants or some state assistance there. And then all three groups were pretty quick to mention condo laws. And that might be a role where PSRC can play in working with the state, and how do we address laws about condos so that we make ownership more accessible to more people. So those were some of the summations of the different categories. We want to look ahead about updating the chapter, and just check in with you real quickly. Again, we'll come back to you and talk more about this, so it's not looking for you to make a policy decision here, but essentially we can update the chapter with current information about the housing market and some of the housing data, retain some of those good policies that are there, explore some new housing actions, and potentially, what I guess I heard from these three conversations just real general, and you can tell me if this should be confirmed, and we can try to brainstorm some ways about how to include this appropriately in the document. But from a housing supply standpoint, that there should be some expectation that all communities, especially communities with TUD opportunities, are planning for that long-term housing supply. So that we want that. And we want to support that, both through technical assistance, potentially through state funding, but having some discussion in the regional plan that there's that expectation. All communities are working to address the housing needs in their communities. We're on the right track there, kind of as a broad statement. And then, and on affordability, and Laura, you just mentioned maybe there's a little bit of a difference, and maybe we can cover it in a nuance of language, but to some degree at least, an expectation that all communities, or at least communities around these higher growth areas or centers or transit, are all working to address an element of affordability. And we can maybe come back and kind of debate as to, what that means or to what extent, but an expectation that all communities are implementing some plan to address lower income needs in their community. Is that fair to say? Is there general kind of interest in that? Not looking at putting, a PSRC requirement of you must build 2,000 housing units at this level, but maybe working towards more just getting away from just, hey, we have an adopted policy, towards all communities are trying to implement some of these different tools, and different tools might be appropriate in different communities, but all communities are working towards that. Councilmember Robinson.
I would just say that I think the goal should be a variety of housing, and not that there's an emphasis on low income, because if you look at the whole spectrum, you will create low income organically. And so there needs to be a focus on low income, but there needs to be a focus on a whole spectrum, I think. That should be the goal.
Great. So I think we will, as I said, we'll work on identifying more concretely the types of changes to that housing chapter, and how we might add in some of these concepts into either policies or actions that we have today. Try to keep them at that regional level rather than getting too down in the weeds. Bring this back to you at one of your future meetings for some additional discussion. I want to thank you for some great breakout discussions. As I said, we'll keep the notes of all these discussions handy. And with that, unless there's anything more, I want to turn it to the next agenda item.
Councilmember Robinson, your card's still up? Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you for the good discussion, everyone. And thank you to our facilitators. So our last discussion item is about the Regional Open Space Conservation Plan, inviting Erica Harris from our staff up. The last time this policy board got to touch the Regional Open Space Plan, it was still in draft form, and that was back in February. So the plan has now been adopted with a lot of our input, and we're going to learn about how the elements of the plan can be incorporated into Vision 2050. Erica.
Great. I'm glad to be able to join you. You've had a really important discussion, and I think open space is actually quite complementary and is working towards all our goals we have as a region. So first of all, I want to thank all of you for all the work you've done so far in conserving open space. It's the natural infrastructure that provides essential services, clean water, clean air, recreation, housing, building products, food. As you know, it's really the basis for our economy, our quality of life, our health. So we always hear about those things when connected to open space. So we made a lot of progress over the years. But as you'll hear from Maria, we still have some work to be done to do. And that really gets to the purpose of the plan, which is to hopefully accelerate the conservation of open space, especially when we think about the growth that's to come. It becomes even more important. So we've tried to create this plan by weaving together the different types of open space plans that we have already created. We have a wide definition of open space, as you've heard in the past, based on the Ross project. It's farms, it's forests, it's parks, it's trails, natural areas, aquatic systems, and we wanted to build upon all the good work that's already been done, and also kind of see where those overlaps are. Where can we get those multiple benefits by looking at those open space projects that are still left to do? So in putting together this plan over the last year and a half, we worked with a lot of different people. We had an advisory committee made up of a variety of stakeholders from throughout the region, as well as working closely with the county teams. And those folks from the counties were working across many departments. So it was great to see Public Works working with planning, working with parks. And we were able to also talk to lots of different stakeholders. So we had lots of discussions and presentations. We were able to do this work thanks to the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities. He gave us a grant. We were able to hire Maria. And now that the grant is wrapping up, Maria has a job as a shoreline planner in the Department of Ecology. So you can find her there, but they let us borrow her from time to time. So we're grateful for that. So I just wanted to thank all of you for providing all of your folks to give us input, and then perhaps you gave us input directly as well. When we came in February, we talked about what was in the draft, and we got some good feedback from all sorts of folks. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Maria, and she'll go through some of the highlights of the plan.
Okay, as a reminder, our plan covers the 8 major watersheds that overlap with our region, shown here on the map. And this plan presents for the first time ever our regional open space network. And this is a collection of public and private lands that represent our regionally significant open spaces that support our quality of life. We have 6 categories of open space: farmland, working forest, aquatic systems, natural lands, urban open space, which is our system of parks and designated green spaces, and also regional trails. And so you can see on the left a map of our network, and on the right, these bubbles give a sense of how much land we're talking about and how much overlap there is. We also calculated or estimated our conservation needs, so what is left to be done for our regional open space network. And to do this, so these are the open spaces that are most at risk of development and loss. So we started by looking at the open spaces that are not in long-term protection, so they're not in fee ownership or have a conservation easement. And then we had different definitions for each of our categories. So for farmland, that was it. If it wasn't protected, we're considering it a conservation need. For working forests, we also narrowed that down to forests that are not designated for forestry or that are smaller than 20 acres. For aquatic systems and natural lands, these are unprotected areas that are also undeveloped. And trails are a little bit different. These are trails that we need to build so that are going to complete an existing trail or connect trails. In some cases, entirely new trails that are planned. And we don't have urban open space on here, but I am going to talk about that. And so then we were able to actually estimate the acreages for each of these categories and in each of our watersheds, so we can start to get a sense of the scope of work we have ahead of us. And then, okay, so as Erica mentioned, we had a draft in January, and we got about 25 comments from a variety of groups. They were really great comments. Overall, everyone was very supportive of the plan. They clearly wanted to see this be very successful. We had many people clearly read the whole plan page by page and provide some really detailed comments. The biggest theme that we heard from many commenters was that we really needed to have more on urban open space in our plan, because this is the open space that everybody experiences on a regular basis. This is our most frequent interaction with open space. So, we wanted to add more about the benefits and challenges of maintaining and increasing urban open space. We had several commenters ask, well, what are the conservation needs for urban open space? We had calculated that for other categories. How many more parks do we need? And we also had some great input on more tools and actions that we can have to increase access. We also heard from a couple different Native American tribes. They provided some input on how we could better incorporate the history of open space in our region as it relates to tribes, and also how we can better protect tribal treaty rights. We had some comments that we should add a strategy on regional trails, since that's one of our categories of open space. And we were also able to work with some drinking water groups to better incorporate areas that protect clean drinking water in our region, to make sure that's in our network. So the urban open space needs, this is one of the bigger changes from the draft to the final. It's pretty hard to calculate this across the region because this is such a local issue and each community has different needs. But we wanted at a regional level to at least highlight this issue and provide a base level of needs so that we can elevate this and hopefully accelerate some investments here. So previously we had presented an analysis on access to open space in the region and how many people have access to close access to open space. So for this analysis, we looked at the areas that don't have access, the gap areas, and tried to start prioritizing those gap areas. And we used two parameters to prioritize them. One is level of canopy cover or tree cover in the gap areas, with the idea that park gap areas with less canopy cover are a more urgent need to address, and areas that have more canopy cover are less urgent. The other parameter we looked at was demographics, to try and identify areas with higher numbers of people from historically underserved communities. So we included income level, race, and English language proficiency in an index to identify areas with the assumption that gap areas that have a higher proportion of residents from underserved communities, it would be a more urgent need to address. And this map on the right, this actually doesn't show the gap areas. It shows census block groups that overlap with the gap areas. That allowed us to bring in demographics, but it kind of makes it look like a slightly larger area than it actually is. So the red block groups on here are the highest priority, and those are areas that have both a low level of canopy cover. So all of these areas lack access to urban open space, but the red have both low canopy cover and a high proportion of residents from a historically underserved community. And so we are recognizing those as our biggest gap needs, and those represent about 24 distinct areas around the region. So we're saying at a minimum, we're going to need 24 parks or similar open space investments just to address those neediest gap areas. And then we also wanted to think about our regional growth strategy. We know that as a region, we want to direct a significant share of our future growth to regional growth centers. And in order to support that, we want to make sure that there's urban open space there to make them attractive for new residents. So we overlaid those with our gap areas and identified an additional 4 gap areas that overlap with regional growth centers. And we wanted to elevate those as also a priority for open space investment. And then we did a similar thing with transit communities. And these are the areas that are within walking distance of a light rail station, either existing or planned, and also other high-capacity transit stations. And we found an additional 19 gap areas that overlap with transit communities, so we also wanted to elevate those. And so this sums to a total of 47 locations with our neediest gap areas, although this wouldn't address all of our gaps. Last time we were here, we presented an action plan. I walked through each of the strategies. Today, I'm just going to highlight some of the changes from the draft. One of the we heard a lot of comments on the importance of protecting farmland, and also that we should include purchase of development rights as a tool in addition to just transfer of development rights, that we should be working to increase resources for that. We, in reflection of the importance of urban open space, moved that up a bit in the action plan and reworded it to make it more clear what we're trying to accomplish. We added a strategy on building out a regional trail network. We heard that enhancing stewardship, previously we had just focused on private lands, but we heard that public lands also need enhanced stewardship, so we wanted to recognize that in the strategy. And then a little bit of news for the 10th strategy, building multi-benefit green infrastructure. PSRC is working on a Puget Sound partnership near-term action to get funding for a project to accelerate the development of stormwater parks. So stay tuned for that, and hopefully that's one of the ways we can already start getting this action plan in action. Hand it over to Erica.
All right, so now that we have a plan, we'd love your help in getting the word out. Since we've been working with so many partners, I think it's already out there, but implementation is only as good as its being looked at. So we've got a number of tools that we identified in the plan that we think are promising to help accelerate open space conservation. We already mentioned transfer of development rights, but I think that this is probably ripe in the conversation of future regional growth and opportunities for upzoning. And since it can be paired with affordable housing, I think we should really look closely at those opportunities. Conservation finance and ecosystem service markets. These things haven't been used too much in this area, but they have more on the East Coast. And FutureWise is looking at a toolkit for trying to see how these can work more in Puget Sound. Return on investment analysis is a way to understand the benefits of these open space projects. And one project in Pierce County that we highlighted showed a 20-to-1 return on investment. So it can be pretty significant and really make the case for these types of investments. A number of cities and counties have worked on watershed management plans, but I think we'll see more and more them. I think ecology is actually going to start pointing to them as a good resource for looking at land use planning as well as stormwater management. And getting to that stormwater management, the multi-benefit green infrastructure that Maria mentioned is another opportunity to improve water quality and pair it with open space. And the hazard mitigation plans, we had heard from FEMA that they actually can pay for open space conservation projects if they are in the hazard mitigation plan. So getting those in up front might be a very good tool, because that's one of the FEMA is one of the only sources of funding that's actually increasing, through the federal government. So before I talked about incorporating open space into Vision 2050, I wanted to acknowledge the Emerald Alliance. We had talked about them a little bit more, but Tracy Stanton, the executive director, is in the audience. I'm sure she'd be happy to chat with any of you afterwards, but she and her partners at the Emerald Alliance, and that's a multi-sector group of folks who are working together to try to help each other conserve and educate around open space. They just received a grant from our same grantor, the U.S. Endowment, to put together a funding strategy for this plan. So it's very exciting to see that this work will continue and hopefully help us find some more funding, because that's really the biggest challenge here. So please talk to Tracy if you'd like to hear more about that. And you'll see a link to this group on our website once they've got one up and running. So Vision 2050, similar to the discussion on housing, there are a few major categories of opportunities to include open space. So we could add information to the narrative, consider refinements to the multi-county planning policies to support this implementation, and to update actions. Really, those are kind of the main categories, and under sort of what types of policies, they kind of fall into three different buckets. And you'll see the plan has some more specific topic areas, but in general, they're protecting and restoring open space, increasing access to parks, trails, and open space, and then improving water quality, so that green infrastructure gets the water quality as well as some of the other, and these are all interrelated, of course. So that's what I have for you for a presentation. I will mention, maybe I'd like to hear what you think about Vision 2050 and see what questions you have. But I will mention that our advisory committee suggested that we put our open space mapping into Vision 2050 as an update, and maybe look at some kind of a policy to recommend preserving and continuing to conserve open space in the network.
Yeah, so this plan, it has a lot of great information, and actually I want to call out our graphics department did a really nice job of taking the cool work that Maria and Erica have worked on it and making it a really nice and attractive document. But with any of our planning, we don't want the plans to sit on the shelf. So we're excited that FEMA is talking about how funding can be used to help preserve open space as a way to prevent flooding and other kind of disaster prevention tools. We're excited about how stormwater funding can potentially be used in a way. So that was one of the things we identified early on, was that there are different sources of funding, and that with a plan like this, we might be able to see how they can line up, and you might be able to do part of it with one type of funding, part with another. And hoping that this plan also alleviates some of that technical burden on local communities, so that if a community sees a need, they're a smaller community, they see a need, they have flooding or an open space preservation need, that they can pull from this plan and the mapping and GIS data that we did as part of it to really bolster their application. So they're not having to start from scratch at trying to explain why they want some funding, but that they can use a lot of this data. So we think we did a good job of working with a lot of different communities and pulling their data together to create this. And we're hoping that this will be really helpful, both in talking to the investment community, the funding community, as well as with local jurisdictions about how to acquire some of that funding to encourage open space. And then it's also a great source for information and data to plug into Vision 2050 as we go through this update process.
Well, thank you very much for your really hard work. And we talk often in here and throughout the region how important and the conservation, our quality of life is, and it's our competitive advantage for our economy. And so you really helped us document and set our sights on the future to keep that competitive advantage strong, and it's absolutely central to that. So thank you. I'm going to go to Councilmember Lambert and to Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. These are great because my district is half of King County, landmass. I have had a little experience with this, so I just want to say a few things. As we go forward, we need to think about parking. We've had horrible problems with parking and people just parking wherever they dang well please. Emergency vehicles can't get through the trailheads, robberies with the trailheads, and then the garbage that is being thrown everywhere. And I've even talked to Mountain Sound Greenway about some help on that recently. So as more people come out, they need to be informed about the fact that please don't leave a footprint behind that causes to be problems. Next thing is biosolid distribution. Nobody wants to talk about that. Everybody wants to ignore it. But I think at some point if we ignore it, we'll be sorry we ignored it. A lot of our forests have biosolids being put on them. Wherever you are on that, we need to be informed. And the last thing is TDRs. A lot of the TDRs are written in perpetuity. And I like to think we're smart, but perpetuity is a very long time. We have no idea what life's going to be in 100 years or 500 years or 1,000 years. And to write those TDR contracts in perpetuity, I think is a real problem. And it has some negative impact on roads. So if we're going to use King County as a model, the model needs some help. So before we go and use that model, please find out what are the weaknesses. Thank you.
Pete?
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank staff for a tremendous amount of great work in putting this together and the revisions. Maybe just a couple quick comments. One, I want to applaud King County relative to Councilmember Lambert's just brief comments relative to transit to trailheads. I think that is something we need to look much more closely at holistically, of having convenient, frequent transit opportunities and strategies to get folks to open space. But I think closely connected, related to that, is the opportunity that this regional plan provides, which is this notion that parks and open space really know no borders, no political jurisdictional boundaries. Our air, our water, no political boundaries. And the opportunities that we have here in terms of connectivity as a region, multimodal connectivity. I think, in the future, perhaps trails will be a corridor of how we get to work. We're just scratching that surface, I think, now as a region, but I think that's going to be a real viable pursuit in the future. Maybe two other comments. One is about urban density as we drive folks more to our urban core, high-capacity transit opportunities. I think we need to be mindful of not creating concrete jungles. And this gets to quality of life opportunities. As we drive folks more into those urban areas, having areas to convalesce, to socialize, to take your dogs out for a walk in those urban dense areas. I think it's going to be even more important than some of these large regional conservation efforts that we often spend a lot of time talking about. And then I'd say lastly, just on the resiliency piece, I think much more research and evidence coming to bear about how open space and parks are a big factor in helping communities be more resilient. I think the public health nexus here with our parks and our open space in terms of understanding how place matters in terms of our own personal community health and making that linkage and that connection. So again, I want to applaud the effort. Many great opportunities here in actually having a regional lens to look through, and I think it will encourage our jurisdictions as well to reference and be on point with some of these priorities, and then encouraging our state agencies, granting agencies, particularly Recreation Conservation Office and the Funding Board, where we can be competitive as a local jurisdiction perspective in applying for grants to advance these goals. We want to encourage the state board to embrace policies that embrace these priorities, so then I can be competitive when I go for a grant to acquire or conserve a particular property. The state recognizes, embraces these policy priorities, at least from a regional perspective. Thank you, Chair.
Very thoughtful comments. Thank you. Mayor Wheeler?
Thank you, Chair. Excellent summary today, and this ties directly into our discussion about affordable housing, and whether in the decision that we'll make as a body, whether these are suggestions or do we put more teeth into preservation of something that's irreplaceable. And so I applaud the effort. The growth pressures and how we define how we're going to manage it relate directly to our open spaces, because frankly, one of the strategies that is commonly tossed out there is supply exceed demand, and which would put open spaces in jeopardy. And I honestly think we need to relate these two concepts. They're interrelated, and the quality of life is immeasurable. We know that, and so I just wanted to make sure my comments were brought out there, that this is interrelated. And just from a personal value statement, I believe those are preservation. That's non-negotiable. We should be preserving open spaces at all costs.
Thank you. Councilmember Pelletier?
I really enjoyed the presentation, and after a morning of hearing about a lot of housing development, it was really refreshing to hear about open space. And just having read through the State of the Sound report for 2017, I was really heartened to see a lot of connections here between open space and ecological function. And I'm sure you're very aware of the work that the Puget Sound Partnership is doing. And so I'm just really glad to see that connection and see that that's definitely on our radar screen. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Lambert, are you still up?
I want to say one sentence. When we put this in, we need to also put in the fact that when you're out in the woods, there's no cell site coverage. People don't expect that because they're used to being in the urban area, and we have had some serious things happen, including a death recently, because people didn't realize that there was no cell site coverage.
Vice Chair Margison.
Thank you. So the policy areas that you mentioned, and I want to dovetail a little bit on Mr. Mayor's comment regarding, he mentioned public health nexus, and I served on the King County Land Conservation Advisory group, and we talked a lot about improving healthy outcomes as a result of preserving open space and making open space available in our communities, access to open space. And so I don't know if that was part of this conversation, Erica, or not, or whether that's embedded in some of these policies. But I just noticed that it wasn't listed as one of the 3 or 4 bullets, and I thought maybe I better mention it as well because, the previous slide talked about, sort of like open space deserts, as we like to call them. And I think there is a nexus there between healthy outcomes as well. And so I think maybe that's something that we should pay attention to. And look at if our good friend, the doctor from Pierce County was there, he'd be mentioning that as well. So.
I'm to blame for making Erica consolidate her bullet points down to these 3 categories.
We'll talk later.
If there aren't any other tents, I just wanted to go back to one of these maps here. Let's see if I can get back there. It's hard to see this. We're at we have 6,000 square miles in the region. It's hard to print out any map that really does justice to this type of network. One of the things that excited me early on with this process was looking at the regional trail network and hearing about some of the different things that are going on in the county. So I think, Councilmember Schweddy knows about the Centennial Trail connecting up through the majority of Snohomish County. Executive Dammeyer in Pierce County was on hand for the opening of the Foothills Trail connecting out to Buckley, and that's scheduled to connect across to Enumclaw in the future and to connect further southward to Mount Rainier. In Pierce County, that Foothills Trail is getting close to where one can go from Mount Rainier into Tacoma, across the bridge, and up the Cushman Trail through Gig Harbor. So really a significant east-west crossing. Of course, many people are familiar with the Mountains to Sound Trail. Going to look at Councilmember Robinson on trying to fix a couple of the remaining gaps. Once we close those gaps in Bellevue and what's that? Got the funding. So we're making progress there, and I think there's one out by Snoqualmie. We've got just a couple gaps there, and then we'll be able to connect from the ferry terminal downtown here all the way to the top of the pass and the tunnel, and that trail has the potential to connect all the way to Idaho. And when you look at this, and then up in the north, you can take the Centennial Trail, and then from Arlington, there's the potential of connecting to the White Horse Trail that still has a lot of work to do, but the space is there to connect out to Darrington. So you could feasibly or conceivably, be on the Olympic Trail on Olympic Peninsula, connect across into Bainbridge Island to Seattle and up to the pass. You could go from Glacier Peak in Snohomish County, from Darrington to Arlington, all the way back to Seattle, and all the way back to Mount Rainier through a regional trail network. And so what I think, and then also if you look at the open space network, kind of the theme of these 2 conversations here is, this is our network. A lot of this is in, state forest land, federal, national forests, aquifers and water supply systems. We have a lot of that already in some form of protection. So the conservation needs, while it seems huge from perhaps a dollar standpoint or an acre standpoint, it's relatively small compared to what we've already protected. And it's, to me, really exciting that we have programs in place, we have some things happening, we have the ability to both finish out some of these conservation needs, protect our farms and our forest lands, keep those things working, and connect these remaining regional trails together to where we have this connectivity where somebody could, go from a neighborhood in Seattle and bike or hike across the region and connect to Mount Rainier or something like that. It's really seems phenomenal that this isn't kind of a pipe dream. This is actually something that's getting more and more achievable as we make progress.
Thank you for highlighting that, Paul. The plan, it's been said around the table by my peers that this plan is why we choose to live here and why we choose to remain to live here. So thank you for the work in helping us to continue down that path. And I also, there's a lot to lift up, and that's what's great about this. There's a lot to lift up and take and go and work with partners to actually accomplish good work, whether it's finishing trail systems or building more parks where needed and that sort of thing. So it's a lot of practical stuff. And I also really appreciate that you, in the urban space, did a prioritization process for the region already with equity at its core. So thank you for that. I think there's a lot of good practical implementation there. And maybe in the affordable housing section and the housing and growth section, we can just say C conservation plan to fight NIMBYism, fight C conservation plan. This is how we make our communities livable even as they densify and get more compact. So thank you for the good work. Mr. Mayor.
If you would indulge, maybe on a happy note to end with on this topic, under the guise of kind of a vision for trails, a colleague of mine put the following together back in the late 90s, and if I could, I'll read. Our minds will slow, our hearts will race, and our waistlines will recede. Trail stories will be exchanged at the barbershop and in the grocery checkout line. Outdoor equipment stores will make their products reasonable for all society to purchase. Citizens will be able to identify native plants, trees, and animals. We will know our time and place based on seasonal change. When asked where we are from, the answer will begin with the location of the nearest trail. So thank you for indulging me.
Well done. We'll include that in the minutes so everyone can reference that. Everyone, we have August off, so enjoy the rest of your summer. We come back, our next meeting is September the 6th. It too is an extended meeting, so we can have this kind of quality, more robust conversation, and that will be focused again on the regional growth strategy. Paul, is there anything else?
Have a great summer. Hopefully you have some trips planned or not to enjoy just the fabulous summer that we have here locally. We're going to be doing a lot of work on that regional growth strategy you've talked about last time. So I think that'll be a great discussion coming up in September.
Great. We'll see you in September. We stand adjourned. Have a good summer, everybody.
Thank you.